everyone, welcome back to lecture. So I'm going to warn you ahead of time. This lecture is going to be a little bit long, so grab your water, grab a snack, and let's get to it. We have finally made it to the Civil War. Before we dive into talking about all of the battles and everything, I want you to turn back in your textbooks to page 276. There's a purple box in the upper left-hand corner, and it talks about all the different names for the war. And you're going to see that there were many, many different names for the war. There's like 15 names listed here. I'm just going to read a couple to you. The War for Constitutional Liberty, Mr. Lincoln's War, the Brothers' War, the Great Rebellion, the War for Southern Nationality, the Yankee Invasion, the War for Southern Freedom, the War of the North and the South, and the funniest one to me is the Late Unpleasantness, because, you know, war is just unpleasant, that's all. So after Fort Sumter, the North went into the battle. They thought they had the edge on the South, they were confident, and Fort Sumter happened in April. They expected to beat the Confederates by fall. They thought they would whoop the Rebs before fall. So now we're going to talk about the first battle of Manassas, or the first battle of Bull Run. The North and the South used different things to name the battles. One side would use primary cities and that were close to where the battle happened. The other side would use landmarks like a river. So that's why there's two different names for this battle. And as we go through, we'll see that there are a couple other battles that have different names. So going into the first battle of Bull Run, we have the commander for the North. This is our first general for the North, Irvin McDowell. And his mission was to march on Richmond. Richmond is located in the center of the state of Virginia, and that was the capital of the Confederacy. So the goal for the North for a long period of time was to march on Richmond. They will not be successful in getting to Richmond until the end of the Civil War, but we'll get there eventually. So Irvin McDowell is the general for the North, and his goal is to march on Richmond. In the South, we have two commanders, Joseph Johnston and PGT Beauregard. Going into the Battle of Bull Run, the North was unprepared and overconfident. Write it down. The North was unprepared and overconfident. So North, unprepared, and overconfident. And this battle was fought really close to the city of Washington, D.C. And so ladies and gentlemen from Washington rode out in their carriages with their picnic lunches to eat lunch and watch the battle happen. It doesn't really make sense to me because it's a battle where people are killing each other, but that's what they did kind of for entertainment. In this particular battle, Thomas Jackson, who was a Southern commander, earned a nickname. This is a nickname that you're going to want to make sure you write down. So the nickname is Stonewall Jackson because during the battle, he stood firm like a stone wall and spurred his troops on. So Stonewall Jackson, very significant, very important Confederate general. In the first Battle of Bull Run, Stonewall Jackson earned his nickname. At this point in the war, the South was fighting a defensive war. They stuck with the defensive idea for a really long time, and we'll get to when they changed their plans later on in this lecture. So at this point in the war, the South's strategy was defense. South's strategy was defense. All right, so now we're going to move into talking about the results of this particular battle, the Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas. Well, the North learned that their army wasn't as ready as they thought that they were, and that the war was probably going to take a little bit longer than they expected. The South, on the other hand, is now going to be the ones who are overconfident, and they're like, oh my goodness, we're going to be able to beat these Union soldiers so fast. So they thought that they were going to be able to win the war very quickly. You're going to start seeing a trend, so I'm just going to warn you ahead of time. Pretty much whenever a general for the Union side loses a battle, they also lose their job. So at the end of the First Battle of Bull Run, General Irvin McDowell was replaced by General McClellan. And so General McClellan was put in charge of the Union armies. All right, so hesitations and loss for the North. McClellan was extremely cautious. So we're going to move into talking about the Peninsula Campaign. McClellan thought that he was vastly outnumbered by the South, but that was because he had gotten bad intelligence. So the spies that he had sent out brought back information saying, oh no, the South, it's huge, they have so many men. And because of that, McClellan ended up not fighting when he was supposed to. Finally, President Lincoln got fed up and he's like, look, go out there, fight a battle. You can't just be goofing around and because you're scared. So that's when the Peninsula Campaign ended up happening. And so President Abraham Lincoln finally ordered General McClellan to move on Richmond. So what he did was, there you go, McClellan was cautious. He moved between the James and the York rivers, which are what made this peninsula here, and he was sort of successful. He was able to attack the Confederate General Johnston, and he surprised him. General Johnston ended up getting wounded, but McClellan didn't follow up on his advantage, and so it wasn't that great of a win. But the significant thing that happens here is Johnston was wounded and replaced by General Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was a brilliant strategist, and the Confederate President Davis hadn't wanted General Lee to get wounded, so he made him stay at a desk in Richmond. But when Johnston got injured, General Lee was like, look, you need me out in the battlefield making decisions, please send me. And so finally, President Davis agreed and let Lee go out and lead the Confederate Army. So it was probably the best decision that President Davis could have made because General Robert E. Lee was a fantastic general, an excellent strategist, and he is the reason why the Confederate troops did so well for so long during the Civil War. So giving you a picture of General Robert E. Lee, very important general. All right, so then we have the 7 Days Battle. So Lee is in charge of the Confederate Army, McClellan is in charge of the Union Army, and Lee attacked McClellan at 6 different locations and drove him back to Washington, D.C., or towards Washington, D.C., because what McClellan does best is retreat, because remember, he's super cautious. So there's your 7 Days Battle. All right, so what do you think happened to McClellan with his failed campaigns? If you said that he lost his job, then you are correct. So we are now at general number 3 for the Union Army. So we've had Irvin McDowell, George McClellan, and now John Pope. But we're now at the Second Battle of Bull Run, or Second Manassas, depending on which side you ask. And as you can see, Lee ultimately defeated Pope at the Second Battle of Bull Run, but let's talk about what happened. So Jeb Stuart was a cavalry person, so he rode horses, and he was out on one of his scouting expeditions, and he discovered a gift, $300,000, a dress coat, and most importantly, a dispatch book, which told where the Union Army was planning to go. So Lee had all of this information about what the Union Army was planning to do. So they got engaged in the battle, But the person who came in and saved the day was, again, Stonewall Jackson. His soldiers were called the Foot Cavalry because they marched so quickly they were able to get their places almost as if they were riding horses. So they were in the Shenandoah Valley and they marched whole night. They marched 62 miles and they arrived at the battle, obviously tired, but they joined the fight and ended up being successful. So yes, Lee won this particular battle, but Stonewall Jackson gets the credit. So Stonewall Jackson helped win the second battle of Bull Run. Stonewall Jackson helped win the second battle of Bull Run for the Confederates. Stonewall Jackson helped win the second battle of Bull Run for the Confederates. Jackson was an extremely humble man, and he said nothing but the blessing and protection of Providence would have helped him to be successful. So Jackson said, write this down, nothing but the blessing and protection of Providence helped him to win the battle. One more time, nothing but the blessing and protection of Providence. All right, so I think you probably know what's about to happen. John Pope lost a battle, so what's he going to also lose? His job. So there you go. Stonewall Jackson saved the day for the Confederate side, and ta-da! McClellan was put back into command. I hope you're starting to see a trend developing. This is a picture of General George McClellan. He was nicknamed the Little Napoleon because in a lot of his pictures or when he was talking to reporters, he would stand like Napoleon Bonaparte with his hand in his jacket, as you can see in the picture. So there's a picture of George McClellan for you. All right, we're going to shift gears just a little bit here. All of the battles that we've talked about so far have been fought in Virginia. We're going to talk about next the Union blockade, but then we're also going to be shifting to talk about the war in the West as opposed to just the war that was happening in Virginia. So at the beginning of the war, the Union wanted to control the water surrounding the South, and they had two things that they wanted to do to make that happen. First, they wanted a Navy blockade of the southern coast, but remember from last week how we said that the South had a huge amount of coastland, so getting a Navy blockade would be very difficult. And second, the Union wanted to be able to control the Mississippi River. So the first purpose of the blockade was to prevent entry or exit of passengers or commerce. Basically, the North wanted to make sure that no people or stuff would come into the South. Because remember, the South doesn't make a lot of things. They have to import a lot of goods in order to be able to make things happen. They don't have the factories. They can't make the things themselves, so they had to import stuff. So if the blockade would be successful, it would stop things from coming into the country, into the South. President Lincoln started the blockade in 1861, right after Fort Sumter. So the blockade happened right from the very beginning. Eventually, the blockade spread all the way from the Mexican border down in Texas, all across the Gulf states, down and around Florida, and all the way up to the Potomac River, which is right where Washington, D.C. is at. So eventually, the blockade covered all of the South. The second part of the blockade strategy was to gain control of the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River was an important water highway for the South. They could transport troops, they could transport supplies up and down the Mississippi River. So if the Union was able to control that, not only would they control the supplies traveling up and down the Mississippi River, they'd also cut off some of those states that were to the west of the Mississippi River, specifically Texas. So the South, of course, didn't want to be blockaded, so they tried to evade it. And one of the ways that they did that was through blockade runners. Now, blockade runners were ships that were designed to slip through the blockades because they were small, they could sail very quickly, they could sail in shallow water, and they were painted gray to kind of blend in with the ocean, so it would have been harder to see them. The most significant port for the blockade runners, or the best port for the blockade runners, was Wilmington, North Carolina. It had several different exits, so if they saw the Union ships coming in one way, they could scooch out and get out a different direction. The British actually helped the Confederacy with blockade running, and so they were able to help the South be a little bit more successful with their blockades. The blockade had a huge result. It majorly impacted the Southern economy. And so it did its job. It broke down the Southern economy. It made it so that it was hard for people to buy things like things that were made out of metal or fabric, because they didn't really weave a lot of their own fabric. And it really eventually broke the spirit of the regular Southern people, not necessarily the soldiers, but the regular Southern people, because they couldn't get the things that they would have liked to have been able to get. All right, so now we're going to talk about the war in the West. In the war in the West, the whole point was to be able to gain control of the Mississippi River. The reason they wanted to get control of the Mississippi River is because it would have separated Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana from the rest of the Confederate States. There were only 11 Confederate States to begin with, so if you're separating 3 of them, it reduces the number even further. All right, remember this name right here, Ulysses S. Grant. So Ulysses S. Grant was the Union commander in charge of the war in the West. First, he captured 2 forts on the Cumberland River, and those were Fort Henry and Fort Donaldson. Actually, let me rephrase that. He captured Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donaldson on the Cumberland River. And then he moved to 2 other cities, Corinth and Shiloh, and he was able to successfully capture both of them as well. Once Fort Henry, Fort Donaldson, Corinth, and Shiloh had fallen to the Union side, the Union controlled all of the upper Mississippi River. Here's a picture of General Ulysses S. Grant. As you can see, he's a little rough around the edges, but he was a very successful general. And his nickname became Unconditional Surrender, because U.S. Grant would be how you would abbreviate his name. So the Southerners switched that around a little bit and changed the U for Ulysses to Unconditional and the S to Surrender. So Grant's nickname was Unconditional Surrender because he would demand an absolute unconditional surrender whenever he captured a location. All right, so after the upper Mississippi was taken control of, then we needed to gain the lower Mississippi, and that happened in 2 different ways. One person moved up from the south, and then General Ulysses S. Grant came down from the north. And so both of those people working together were able to capture the rest of the Mississippi. So we're going to talk about Admiral David Farragut, and he was the one who was down in the south near in the Gulf of Mexico. So to protect the Mississippi River, the South had put a giant chain across the end of the Mississippi River, and that made it so that if a ship was sailing along, the bottom part of the ship would run into this chain and it wouldn't be able to get into the Mississippi River. So kind of like building a wall underneath the river, but it was a giant chain. So Admiral David Farragut came up with a plan, and his plan was to bypass the forts that were on either side of this chain, so get around the forts and unhook the chain, and then have these gunboats go past the forts and then attack New Orleans, and New Orleans ended up surrendering. So Admiral David Farragut was successful and he captured the city of New Orleans. Then we come to the Battle of Vicksburg. This is the most significant battle when it comes to talking about taking care of the Mississippi River. So Vicksburg was situated up on a hill. Because of that, there were high cliffs that surrounded the city of Vicksburg, and then the river went around like this. So anytime that any Union army would try and attack Vicksburg, they would try and come by the river. Vicksburg, up on the city, or up on the hill, ended up firing their cannons down on any ship that went past them, and they were successful. They were protected. The Union tried 6 times to capture Vicksburg, unsuccessfully, until Ulysses S. Grant showed up, and he had a different plan. His plan was to attack Vicksburg not by the river, but on the land, and to cut off the supplies that were being sent into Vicksburg. And of course, Ulysses S. Grant was successful. So, first of all, he got his army ready, and he told his soldiers to carry all of their supplies on their back. Normally what would happen is that a supply train would be connected, and the train would bring the supplies, food, extra ammunition, anything that they needed would be sent in. But that would be a weakness, because then the army would be relying on these supplies to be being brought in. But General Grant wanted to make it so that the army was independent and didn't need any extra supplies. So Grant got to the city of Vicksburg, cut off all of the supplies that were being sent into Vicksburg, and so we have the Northern General Ulysses S. Grant, the Southern General John Pemberton, and he was like, well, if we just cut off General Grant's supplies, then we'll be good. But General Grant didn't have any supplies, so ultimately General Pemberton had to go back to the city of Vicksburg, and there was a siege, and eventually the city of Vicksburg fell to General Grant after a 6-week-long siege. And in a span of 18 months, a year and a half, General Grant had successfully captured all of the Mississippi River, both the northern Mississippi River and the upper Mississippi and the lower Mississippi, all belonged to the Union side after 18 months. All right, water. Okay, we're moving into our last section. We're going to get to meet a few more generals as well. So the South's strategy was changing. Lee decided, instead of just fighting on the defense, which had been the South's strategy up to this point, now it was time for them to go on offense. He was hoping to get Southern sympathizers in Maryland to join in the cause, because if you remember from last week, Maryland was under martial law, which means the military was controlling the city of Maryland and was not letting them decide whether they wanted to go for the South or go for the North. And he also was hoping to get England to join in with the South. So our first battle that we're going to talk about in this section is the Battle of Antietam. So Lee hoped to arouse Southern sympathizers, specifically in the state of Maryland. Maryland was a productive grain state. Armies need grain in order to be successful. And he hoped to get British support. So that's why the North went towards Antietam to fight Antietam. All right, so getting ready to go into the Battle of Antietam, General Lee did something very risky. He divided his army. Stonewall Jackson went up the Shenandoah Valley, and Jeb Stuart stayed behind to protect the rear, and then General Lee took his army up towards Antietam. General McClellan got a gift. He discovered Lee's location. He found out that the army had been divided, and he hoped to force Lee into a battle before Lee could be reinforced. So a Confederate dispatch was found in the road wrapped in 3 cigars. So there was a bundle of 3 cigars wrapped with the directions or the dispatch saying what the South's war plans were. So this was a gift that General McClellan ended up squandering. So McClellan got a gift before Antietam, 3 cigars wrapped in a dispatch. So he found out that the Confederate Army was divided, and then he hoped to attack before the reinforcements arrived. So we get to the Battle of Antietam. McClellan launched a huge attack, but again, he hesitated and he didn't take advantage of the win and ended up letting Lee escape. So McClellan failed to take advantage of his superior numbers and never pursued Lee when Lee was weakened. And so because of that, this battle is actually kind of considered a stalemate. And we'll talk about why in just a moment. So McClellan failed to take advantage of this win, but Abraham Lincoln did not fail to take advantage of this. So the results of the Battle of Antietam. First, the South failed to win, made it so that the British would not recognize the Confederacy as a country, and so the British never joined the war on the side of the Confederates. This is very, very important. Make sure you write this down. The North ended up issuing the Emancipation Proclamation after the end of the Battle of Antietam. Now we're going to talk about what the Emancipation Proclamation was on the next slide. So hold that thought for just a second. And this is an important fact. The Battle of Antietam was the single bloodiest day in the history of American wars. So the Battle of Antietam was a single day battle, and in this particular battle, the largest number of American soldiers died in any day of any war that the United States has been involved in, because it's a civil war, so Americans are fighting against Americans, and this day ended up being the bloodiest day in the history of American wars. So make sure you write that down. So now let's talk about the Emancipation Proclamation for just a moment. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued to help revive Northern support for the war. The war has been going on for a couple of years now, and the Northerners are getting tired. They're not seeing success. They're not seeing the country come back to be unified, because remember, that was the original goal of the Civil War, to bring unity back to the United States. And the Emancipation Proclamation actually changed the purpose of the war. It freed all slaves held in Confederate territory. So what that means is it had no effect over anyone who was living in the North and was enslaved, but it did free anyone who was in a Confederate territory, a Confederate state, and was enslaved. So basically, it gave the slaves hope that once the North got to whatever state they were in, that they would end up being freed. Changed the entire purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation changed the entire purpose of the war. So we have a few results. It caused the Southern slaves to desert their masters because they realized once the North gets here, we're going to be free. So why do we need to stay around anyways? It also ended the possibility of British support for the South, which pretty much happened because of the Battle of Antietam. And it paved a way for public acceptance of the end of slavery. Like I said at the beginning of this slide, it basically changed the purpose of the war. It made it so that it was about freeing slaves and not just about unifying the country again. So let me read to you just a tiny bit about the Emancipation Proclamation. Get to the page. So before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, the North was not fighting a war to free the slaves. Some people thought the war was fought to end slavery, but the war's stated purpose was simply to preserve the Union. That was the reason that the Northern soldiers gave for the war. The Emancipation Proclamation changed many people's outlook towards the war, and then it revived the support for the Northerners to continue this war against the South. So, what do you know? The North has a new commander. I have to show you this picture. This is Ambrose Burnside, and he replaced McClellan as the commander of the Union Army. Hope you get a good laugh over his lovely facial hair. So now we are on another commander for the Union Army. And Burnside was put into command, and immediately he continued the North's all-the-time goal, capture Richmond. But there's a city that stands in between where he was and the city of Richmond, and that's Fredericksburg. So General Ambrose Burnside gets to Fredericksburg, and Fredericksburg has a giant hill, and the Confederate forces are entrenched or dug down into the hill. They're protected. But that doesn't stop General Burnside. He decides that he is going to force his soldiers to go up the hill to attack the Confederates. So the Union encountered entrenched Confederate forces, and there were massive Union casualties because the North just tried to walk up the hill, but the Southerners are in their trenches firing down on the Union soldiers, and the South lost way more people than the North did. The Union ended up losing twice as many soldiers as the Confederates, and they also didn't win the Battle of Fredericksburg. They didn't take control of the land, and so I think you can guess what happened. General Burnside was replaced by another general, Fighting Joe Hooker. So let's just pause for a moment. We had Irwin McDowell, General McClellan, General Pope, General McClellan, General Burnside, and now we're on General Joe Hooker. 6 generals for the Union side, and the Confederates have had 2, Joseph Johnston and Robert E. Lee. So General Hooker took over the Union Army, and he started the continued march towards Richmond. The battle that he fought was Chancellorsville. Going into the Battle of Chancellorsville, he was very confident, and he thought that he was going to easily be able to beat the Confederates, although no one before him had been able to easily beat the Confederates. So going into the battle, General Lee, the Confederate general, took a risk. He divided his army, and this caught the Union by surprise, and Lee was able to batter the Union army for 5 days. This was a major victory for the South, and it is often believed to be Lee's finest battle. However, this huge victory came at a massive cost for the South because General Stonewall Jackson was wounded in the battle and ended up dying. He was out on a scouting expedition with a few of his soldiers and came across some Confederates, and they were surprised, and there were people there, so they fired. And one of the bullets ended up hitting General Jackson in the left arm. His arm was amputated, but he was never able to fully recover and ended up getting pneumonia shortly after, and that's what actually killed him. Just a little bit of information about Stonewall Jackson. He was a very strong Christian, but he was also a little eccentric. He loved sucking on lemons. He thought that good posture was very important so that it wouldn't compress your internal organs. He also would hold one arm up in the air to promote blood flow. So very interesting man, but he was brilliant, great at strategy, and also obviously very brave. After his arm was amputated, General Lee is famous for having said, "Jackson has lost his left arm, but I have lost my right," because Stonewall Jackson was basically General Lee's right-hand man. This is a picture of General Stonewall Jackson. All right, so I'm sure you could feel this one coming. The North lost a battle, so they replaced him. So the General Hooker was replaced by General George Meade just a few days before the Battle of Gettysburg. We have finally reached our final battle for this lecture. We are almost done. All right, so Lee decided to head up towards Gettysburg. Gettysburg is located in the state of Pennsylvania, obviously not in Virginia anymore. And so there are a couple reasons why the Southerners decided to go up towards to Gettysburg. First, General Lee was hoping to turn the Northern population against the war. The Northerners were still very tired of fighting this war, and they kept losing, so obviously they should be tired of the war. And he was also hoping to force President Lincoln to pull troops out of the Mississippi region. The North had been very successful in the Mississippi region, and General Grant had taken over all of the Mississippi region, and so Lee was hoping to force President Lincoln to get those troops out and move them back towards the east. He was also hoping to resupply troops because there was a rumor that there were shoes located in Gettysburg. There weren't, but that was part of the reason why the South went to Gettysburg. All right, so Gettysburg was a 3-day long battle, and we're going to just give a quick overview of each day. The first day, actually, let me talk about the terrain of Gettysburg. Gettysburg is located in the middle of two hills. One is called Seminary Ridge and one is called Cemetery Ridge. And the Northerners occupied one hill and the Southerners occupied the other hill. On the first day, the Southerners came down their hill and attacked the Union, but the line didn't break, and so they ended up having to retreat and go back to their side. Second day of the battle, the Union was again attacked, but again their line held firm. General Longstreet for the Confederates attacked the left flank of the Union Army, but they were never able to go around the corner and completely flank the Union side, so they held firm. Then on the third day of the battle, we have the infamous Pickett's Charge. It was an absolute disaster. The Union lost 2,300 men, but the South lost over 3,000 men. Or, sorry, the Union lost 2,300 men and the South lost over 3,000 men. And Pickett's Charge is known as the high water mark of the Confederacy because this was the furthest north that the Confederates ever got. So, Pickett's Charge, high water mark of the Confederacy. Pickett's Charge is known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. One more time, because you need to write it down. Pickett's Charge was the high water mark of the Confederacy. All right, so the results of the Battle of Gettysburg. Meade allowed General Lee to retreat to Virginia. Spoiler alert, Meade is going to be replaced. This proved to be the turning point of the war. This was the last battle where the Confederates actually had a fighting chance. After this, it's all downhill, and the Confederates lose, 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 lose. The Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. So I know that I told you that Antietam was the bloodiest single-day battle of the war. Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle, and it was 3 days long. And from the Battle of Gettysburg, the South never recovered. Ultimately, Lincoln gave his very famous Gettysburg Address in November of 1863, and that was to dedicate the cemetery that is located in Gettysburg. So we did it. That's all that we need to cover for this week. Good job, and good luck on your quiz.